Folks, today is July 1st, which means we are officially halfway through 2023. We're at a checkpoint. We're going to have a lot of grades today on how a lot of these teams have done throughout the season, starting off with the Reds and Guardians in Major League Baseball, and then moving over to FC Cincinnati and Columbus Crew with Major League Soccer. We'll also talk about the games they had this past week and what we will expect going into the 4th of July week. Hello, everyone. I'm Ahirson Hassan, your host, and welcome to another episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown, a show about teams from the great state of Ohio. We've got a lot to talk about, including quick hits, plus those four teams that I just mentioned. But first, I have a little announcement. Now, some of you may know this, but in a few weeks, I will actually be moving from Cincinnati to Phoenix. Now, I'm already out at ASU most of the year as a student over there. You know it, you know it if you know it. But the other thing you may not know is that my parents and my brother, they're also moving to Phoenix this summer, which means I'm going to be leaving Cincinnati and leaving the great state of Ohio. Not much more I can say other than what an amazing 17 years it has been living in the city. Some of my favorite memories have been watching guys like FC Cincinnati, the Reds, the Bengals, especially over the past couple of years or so, and the way they've just captivated a city in all of its attention. I absolutely love this city. I absolutely love the state, and it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough leaving it, but that's the thing with transitions. Sometimes you close a door and you open something that could be a lot better down the stretch. It's a lot of parts when it comes to moving as well. So you may not know this, but I had an option to take an internship over the summer. I ended up not taking it mainly to help with moving, but also the fact of this is a great city. This is a great state as well, and I wanted to soak up every minute that I could in it. Sometimes you come to a place not knowing what to expect. You think you're going to someplace else. You think you're not going to spend a lot of time there, and that was certainly the case with my parents. But you never know how a city comes in and changes you. You never know how a city comes in and shapes the love that you have for sport, for yourself, for your friends, your family. And I think that's what Cincinnati has done for me and definitely my family members as well. There will be a few things I'll be doing to kind of wrap up my time here in Cincinnati. Of course, if you're on TikTok, you'll know pretty well all the stuff I'll put out. There will also be another YouTube episode, or rather, not an episode, but I will put out a video that will be me kind of saying my goodbye letter to Cincinnati. But as I mentioned, this is a great city, this is a great state, and I'm surely going to miss it. Now, on to the quick hits. And we'll actually start off in Columbus today with Lower.com Field and the Columbus Crew, who will be hosting the 2024 MLS All Star game. Again, we don't know the opponent, but it's sure to be good. I mean, I think that's what we wanted to see from Lower.com Field, especially knowing the fact that it was a newer stadium. It was built in 2021. Kind of shows like what the MLS wants to be, what it wants to show as well, with the atmosphere too, because you have to understand, like, compared to what Columbus was, at least from a supporter's perspective, at Moffrey Stadium, compared to what it is at Lower.com Field, it has gotten 10 times better, it seems like. And it will be truly amazing to show that on a national level and maybe an international level, depending on who they play in the All Star game. We'll stay in Columbus for the second quick hit, which is the NHL draft, and the Blue Jackets selected Adam Fantilli out of Michigan. Now, I don't know much about hockey, but this was a surprise to a lot of hockey fans that I know of, as they were expecting Fantilli to go a little bit higher. Of course, Connor Bedard ended up taking the number one spot. He'll be heading to the Blackhawks. So, unfortunately, Columbus won't get him, but that's a good sign if you can get a guy like Fantilli out of the gate, out of the running. You want a guy that can really spark the team, whether that be from the offense perspective, from the defensive perspective as well. The one thing I note about some guys, including Adam Fantilli, is the fact that they can get up the ice and try to get some points going forward. And I've mentioned this before, but Columbus has not had a solid score all around since maybe Artemi Panarin or Nick Foligno. It's been that long for this team, and especially with Fantilli playing center, you do have a guy now that who can really just barrel down the center of the ice and get some good looks on goal. So credit to Columbus for that pick because it seems like it might turn out pretty good. There was a lot of hype, and it's sure living up to it. And finally, the Taylor Swift Eras Tour is in Cincinnati this weekend. I know it's not anything to do with sports. I was outside Paycor Stadium listening to it last night. Absolutely electric, both inside and outside of the stadium. Now, you're probably wondering to me, Mahir, why does this have anything to do with sports? Here's why. Some of the revenue from this weekend will be split between Hamilton County and the Bengals. So, if you will, some of those sales, aka some of the Swifties, are helping out for the Bengals contracts, including T. Higgins and Logan Wilson, who have some big ones coming up at the end of this season. All right, on to the Reds, America's team. And boy, they had an America's team like week in the past 7 days. They faced the Braves, the team that is first in the National League, second best in Major League Baseball, and then the Orioles, second in the AL East, but don't get it wrong. They're sharing the AL East with the Tampa Bay Rays, who are the best team in the league. So the Orioles are actually third best when it comes to their record. Overall, not a bad week. 3-3. You went 500 against two of the top three teams in Major League Baseball, 1-2 against the Braves, 2-1 against the Orioles. But I don't think it does justice, especially the Brave series. I don't think it does justice to what the Reds are doing right now because every Braves game was decided by a run. The Orioles wins were a little bit closer, even though the Reds kind of were able to spew on the runs come extra innings. But nonetheless, it is a little bit different, if you will. And when I say different, it's a case that yes, it is a little treacherous at times, and this past week showed it. You're not going to have like a 12-game win streak week in, week out. But at the same time, it really shows you what this team can do when it comes to results. So you look at that, you're happy. When you look at the crowning achievements that have happened this past week, Joey Votto hits back-to-back home runs. Ellie De La Cruz becomes the first Red to hit for the cycle since 1989. Just really great stuff. And Ellie De La Cruz, again, almost got the game-winning run. He was tagged out at home. But, hey, Spencer Steer with a walk-off home run to win it in extra innings yesterday. So kudos to the Reds. Pitching can be a little tough, and I think the craziest thing is the fact that you have Hunter Green, who's on IL right now. Graham Ashcraft was on the mound yesterday, and he actually did a very good job, only allowing a run in 7 innings, and that run was actually off a solo shot. So it seems like Graham Ashcraft is back to doing Graham Ashcraft type stuff. So we like to see that. Brandon Williamson was all right, I guess. And Luke Weaver. Here, this is the funniest thing. Luke Weaver is an enigma, and here's why. He was the pitcher on Friday when the Reds beat the Braves in that shootout 11-10. He was the pitcher also on Wednesday when the Reds piled on the runs late against Baltimore. That was a high-scoring game. Both of them in that regards, high-scoring game. And it almost goes just hand in hand with how the Reds kind of show you what they can do when they have to rally because boy, do they show up. It was their 30th comeback win of the year last night against the Padres. I think that's pretty amazing. And they've got the lead in the NL Central once again because the Brewers lost to the Pirates. So kudos to them. They got a chance to extend on that this week, or at the very least, hold it, knowing that the Reds have a pretty easy schedule in that regards, as they got the Padres and then they got the Nats on the road. More on the National Series later. But let's go back to that Braves-Red series. I saw this on ESPN. I forget if it's the record for most or tied for the most, but the record was home runs in a 3-game series, and I think it was like in the 20s for a 3-game series. So do the math. That's about 7 home runs in a game, which I think is insane. If you like baseball, and that is if you like explosive plays, this team is right for you, even if they're the ones allowing it. But nonetheless, it is pretty fun to watch this team, and I think it kind of gives me the inkling, and some Reds fans will disagree with me on this. but it almost makes you want a Reds Braves series. Yes, this team has to go to Atlanta, and those games might get a little interesting, but you think about it, like if from a hypothetical perspective, if the Reds can do it, if the Reds can go to Atlanta and face the Braves in the playoff series, that might actually be a really interesting one. And that might be the best playoff series we may see in a while, knowing what we saw last week at GABP. So this would be really interesting. The Orioles game was a little bit more solid and gritty down the stretch, but a lot of late game play and a lot of rebound as well. Even on Wednesday, too. Reds are up 7-4. Buck Farmer allows a 3-run homer. But hey, they get back on their horse. They're able to stop the Orioles from scoring runs in the ninth. They take it to extras, and they once again win. That shows what you want out of a good squad, right? You want a comeback win, right? This team doesn't get 30 comeback wins on the year. And by the way, we're about halfway through the year. You don't get that unless you really, really show that you can do it. And that's a credit to the Reds this year. The fact that most of their wins have come off comebacks really just states how this team likes to play. They don't care about being down. It's almost a no pressure situation. And maybe it's a sense that because of all of these years of turmoil, you have nothing to lose. And but I think it might go deeper than that because it just shows that a team that I mean, I said it last week, humble, hungry, and smart. That's kind of the motto Nick Kroll and the front office is running with, and the Reds are doing it. So they went 3-3. Now the question is, can they get back to dominating? Got the Padres this weekend, beat them in extra innings last night, and the Padres are on a tough losing streak. Dropped the first game last night. They went 1-3 against the Giants last week, went 1-2 against the Nationals last weekend. That was actually a home series, too, mind you. And then they were swept by the Pirates on the road. And yes, they have a big payroll. And sometimes bad pitching does lead to those grace periods. We saw it last night where the Padres were able to take that lead 4-2 and then 5-4, even though the Reds were able to rally back. I mean, that kind of shows you what the Padres can do, even though this year has not been it. And there's been a little bit inconsistencies, payroll pressure, especially after making the NLCS last year. You know, I think it does make some interesting situations for the Padres. And I think for this weekend too, I mean, and I'm checking like the betting sites and stuff, even with the Reds having a better record than the Padres were favored last night. Now, granted, Yu Darvish was supposed to be on the mound, so I think that was why. But you have the Padres once again favored for today's game, which will be at 1:40 here on July 1st, the day I'm recording this. It's interesting. It's interesting what we'll see out of this team. Maybe the Padres get it together, but I don't know. I mean, they have a tough division unto itself. You got the Dodgers, you got the Giants, you got the D-backs who are playing surprisingly well. They're also like the Reds in some ways. So it is pretty cool. But yeah, on to the Nationals now. And again, I talked about it earlier that the National Series could be interesting. That will be on the road. That will be during 4th of July week, including the 4th of July game Tuesday morning. It is kind of interesting because before the Peacock Sunday leadoff games, where it would kind of be typical to see a game start at like 11 or 11:30 in the morning, that used to be the only game of the year, it felt like, where you could have a chance to see a game start at a.m. or rather in the morning. And it always used to tickle me when I was younger. So when I saw that, I was like, huh, that is kind of interesting. So yeah, 4-game series starts off Monday at 6:05. You got Tuesday's game, of course, at 11:05, Wednesday at 7:05, Thursday at 1:05. So you got the Nationals there. You got the Brewers on the road right after. So we'll talk about that series next week if I have the chance to record an episode. But it will be fun. I'm definitely looking forward to what this team can do, especially against the Nats, knowing that this team started to get some sort of command. They just went to the West Coast, got a series win against the Padres, the defending NLCS champs, and got a series win against the Mariners, who went to the wild card last year for the first time in what seems like forever. It almost seems like this Nationals team is on a rise, and I think if you give them If you give them the pitching that we saw last night or we saw late, like Buck Farmer wise against Baltimore, this is a team that could make the Reds pay for their mistakes. And it feels like this series might have a similar vibe to what we saw in Kansas City, where yes, the Reds are the better team, but the Royals are going to keep it close. Or in this case, the Nationals are going to keep it close. So I would definitely try to see that down the stretch. And I think, yes, these guys are the Rally Reds, but you have to ask the question. I mean, this is the one thing I've learned in sports, especially over the past year, is the fact that like when a team wins like a championship, it's the fact that they did good. It's not the fact that they went perfect because nobody's perfect. It's the fact that they made the least amount of mistakes. And the one thing I question with the Reds, yes, I like the Rally Reds formula, but if there is a chance that you are like, it's something to rally against the Padres down in extra innings and you need to keep the game alive. It's another thing for you to rally when you have a lot of chances to close out the game, and then you're down in a hole, and then you have to come back. And that too against the Nationals. Does not look too good, especially for a team that is dead last in the NL East. Does not look good on your resume, if you will. So again, you have to ask the question, with this team being the Rally Reds, is this the Reds' identity? Do they want to play close games? Do they want to make it interesting? Hey, I mean, for the neutral sports fan, that actually makes things really interesting. For the Reds fan, maybe you're sweating it a little bit, especially knowing the fact that now, since the team is very relevant, you are winning those games to get a wild card spot, to get an NL Central. It is not a far-fetched fantasy anymore. This is for real, and you need to get those types of results down. So that's my biggest question for the Reds going into this week, especially knowing their series in the nation's capital. All right, up the I-71 we go to the Guardians. They also went 3-3 this past weekend, 1-2 against the Brewers, who are fighting with the Reds for the NL Central crown, and 2-1 against the Royals. Lost by a run on Thursday. And again, I've mentioned this before. It was the case when they played the Reds. It was also the case when they went to Tampa to play the Rays. They actually split the series down there. The Royals are just a team that low-key just sticks around. You know, it almost shows to some extent. Again, like I'm not saying that like, oh, what we saw from the Royals series is better than like what we're gonna see from the Guardians against like the Braves, the Orioles, or the Rays. Obviously, those teams are the best in MLB. Those are the totem pole games that really show where the Guardians are. That being said, it almost kind of does show you like it's similar to what we saw with the Reds two ways. Like, they had two games where they won by a run and then they had a blowout win. Guardians, same thing, although they ended up beating the Royals like 14-1 or something on one day. I mean, it was really a blowout, really a blowout. But yeah, a lot of close games, a lot of rallying as well, though theirs usually happens late. But they did lose a lead on Sunday. And again, that's not what you want to see, especially when you're playing the Brewers. I think the other thing is like, yes, the Guardians are there, but they're also in the AL Central. And they could have a legit shot at winning that division, which I think is kind of crazy. I mean, going into Friday, the Guardians and the Twins were tied for the AL Central, which I think is it's almost mind blowing in my opinion. When we look at the AL Central, especially in this new format where everybody's playing almost everybody in the league, it is interesting to see what we see. That being said, it is interesting also when you look at the big pitchers that are there. And I actually thought it was a decent pitcher group for the Guardians. You had Shane Bieber, you had Bybee and Seivale. Bieber lost. It was actually Bybee who got the winning pitch, or rather, he was the one that pitched for the one game the Guardians won. And Bieber and Seivale both lost, which I thought was some of it is to blame on them, and it was definitely the case for Bieber on Friday, as I think he had 4 earned runs, which is pretty high, especially for a guy like Bieber. And then Seivale, some of it was late gameplay, so it was not too much to blame on him. So you have the Royals game 2, close it out, but they need to be on the uptick going into this week against they got the Cubs on the road, and then they've got the Braves at home. It's a tough week. It's a tough week, especially knowing the Cubs. They were a little rough this past week. And when I'm being rough, I mean they went 1-1 in London, and they were actually blew up. They actually coughed up like a 3 or 4 lead in the second game against the Cardinals across the pond. Then they came back to the States, and then they were swept at home against the Phillies. They were able to beat the Guardians last night, or by a pretty resounding margin too, yesterday afternoon. I think it was like 10-1 or something. It was big. It was a big result. But that being said, I mean, it's almost like for the Guardians, especially where you are in the series, where you are in the year, where you're almost halfway, the All-Star break is like maybe 10 days away. You have to say to yourself, all right, that was a loss. That's fine. I almost know this when I watch volleyball. I cover volleyball for a while. I have a podcast on it. And it's almost like when you're watching a set, there's a chance that like one team is blowing out the other. And you're like, what in the world is happening? But I mean, if you're a player or coach, you're saying, all right, we'll take the L this set, but then we need to come back next set stronger and better. And I think that's what the Guardians have to do for a little while, especially after the Royals loss, especially after the Cubs lost yesterday. Reset, regroup, and say, can we really go forward and put up a good result? You have to kind of say to yourself, hey, yes, you went to the Royals. That's kind of a totem pole like marking to some extent. But this is a Cubs team that just got swept by the Phillies, and they're 1-1 against the Cards. And Phillies and Cards are good teams, don't get me wrong, but they're not as good as they were last year, at least not right now. So maybe things change, but from what we've seen, the Guardians might be a better team than both of them. Well, better than the Cardinals, maybe not better than the Phillies. So that's an interesting battle, especially going up against what is a solid roster. I don't know if Marcus Stroman's on the mound for Chicago. He might be. I don't know. And then they got the Braves at home, which I think is another very interesting battle unto itself. I mean, just right after facing the Brewers, I mean, that's where the Guardians really have to show themselves as a caliber team. I don't think it's a very like hype motivated type week. I mean, like, remember how I was for like when the Reds were hosting the Brewers and Dodgers? I was like, all right, you got the NL Central leaders and you got the Dodgers who have been historically good for the past few years or so. Like you get wins against those two teams, we're legit. That's not really the case this week, but I think if the Guardians can do something good against the Braves, if they can do anything other than getting swept, I would say it's a success. If they pick up one, I would say it's moderate. If they win the series, I would definitely be turning my head and saying maybe the Guardians have a chance. I mean, especially I think the biggest thing too is that you want to make a playoff run, right? And the AL Central has been overlooked for a few years now. You want to get something going forward where you can say, "Hey, I like what I do. I love what I do." And that's why and that's why I want to do it, right? And even in the wild card last year, I mean, they were facing a high caliber squad of the Tampa Bay Rays. A lot of people actually had the Rays winning that series over the Guardians, but the Guardians had home field advantage. They showed up late. They're able to get walk-offs both days and win the series. So again, you never know how these games are going to play out. And maybe this Brave series does show you that the Guardians can not only win the AL Central, but they can make a run deep in the playoffs. I mean, we saw them beat the Rays, take the Yankees to 5. I mean, this is a team that's slowly becoming caliber. The question is, can they do it? And that leads me into my grades for the regular season. That is, we're at the halfway point. We're more than 81 games down in the year. We've got a few more to go, at least 70 some more to go in that regards. But nonetheless, you have the Reds, you have the Guardians. We'll start off with the Guardians right now. I'm going to give them a B minus for this year. And you're probably thinking, well, they're kind of doing better. They're still in the running. Yes, they are. But I think it almost goes back to the start of the year because the Reds and the Guardians were in the same boat in the sense that they were both below 500. And for the Guardians, too, contrary to the Reds, they had expectations going into this year to repeat as AL Central champions, to get forward, to really show what kind of a caliber squad they are. The Reds didn't have anything. The Reds were coming off a 100 loss season. But the Guardians, I think, and I mean, that's the biggest question with Terry Francona and crew is can they do it? Because I think when I give my end of the season grades, that's going to be the biggest question is whether or not they make it. As it's going right now, I don't think a single AL Central team that is not the winner of that division is making the playoffs. Let's be very honest. Let's be very honest with ourselves. Unless something drastically changes with that division, nothing's happening. The only team going to the playoffs is that one team. In other words, Cleveland's got to win that division to go to the playoffs. So it would be very interesting to see what ends up happening. And I would say, depending on that, maybe it goes up to a B plus or an A minus. I would say it's above average, especially knowing the fact to repeat as AL Central champions. That is something to be proud of. If it's not there, maybe it goes down to a C or a C minus, because I think this is a year that the Guardians can really build on themselves and I think beat caliber, right? We haven't had a chance to call the Guardians a caliber team. I mean, before last year, we didn't really have that chance since like what, 2016. It's been that long, which I think is just insane overall. Let's go to the Reds now. And this is a much better grade. An A minus. Again, I don't give them an A plus because of the way they started off the season where they're 7-15. And again, we're thinking, here we go again. The Reds are gonna keep us in the running, maybe to get the playoffs, but like by the time we get to July or August, it's gonna be done. We were dead wrong. We were dead wrong. And if the Reds keep it up, this could be a team that could go to the playoffs. There's a lot more hope, a lot more joy in this squad compared to what we saw in 2021, especially with new guys Spencer Steer, Will Benson, Matt McLain, Ellie De La Cruz. Almost like half of your lineup is really good. And not just really good, they're rookies. They're new guys. They're the new kids on the block. So again, I think if the Reds keep it up, this is going to be a year it's an A, because it's something for you to call up a bunch of young kids to try to rebuild your lineup. It's another thing for you to call up those young kids and almost immediately make an impact on the team and get them to the playoffs. I mean, I think about teams like the Diamondbacks as well, where they also have a young team, but like Corbin Carroll and crew, they were still starting last year and stuff. And then only this year is the year that they really make the leap. They start bonding, they start gelling, and they start going forward. That's a kudos to the Reds. That's a kudos to the culture inside the clubhouse on what they can really do. So I'll stand by that pick. The Reds, I'll give them an A minus. So there are your grades for the MLB teams. I'll take a quick break, and when I come back, I'll be talking about the MLS teams, their grades, and also the games this past week and going into the next 7 days. So I gave out my grades for MLB, and now it's time to give out my grades for MLS, at least the MLS teams here in Ohio. And we'll start off with FC Cincinnati. And although have been having a great season, they've had a great season overall. They had lost 3-0 to DC United this past weekend. It was only their second loss of the entire season. All the goals for DC United came in the first half, so it was almost null by the time the break came. But overall, the one thing I would say from this match, and it was frustrating to watch, and I think you expect it when you have Matt Miazga out, when you have Brandon Vasquez out. Nick Hagglund is just coming back. Yerson Mosquera is still trying to deal with something, right? I mean, you have Nick Hagglund, who is coming back off an injury. He did not look 100%. And then your starting two center backs are out. Mosquera is there. He will be there till the end of the season, by the way, because FC Cincinnati extended his loan. The one thing I would say is a lack of focus, because I think there were chances where Gaddis and Powell could have gotten on the ball. And it shows what happens when the defense doesn't get there in time, right? If they don't get there in time anywhere inside the box, maybe Celentano gets into trouble. Maybe they take a dribble. One of the goals, which was off a set piece, it was basically bouncing in the box. One of the DC United players just fires it into that from 15 yards out because nobody gets on it, nobody presses, nothing happens. So the question is, I mean, and I think the one thing I saw was how much can Roman Celentano save that defense? Because yes, the goalkeeper is the CEO of the team. And I remember one of my soccer coaches saying that a few years ago. I've said it on broadcast whenever I've done a soccer broadcast, really. But as the CEO, how much can he save the defense and how much can he really save himself and really put the blame on him? Because the third goal, let's be honest, he should have saved the third goal. It went right through his legs. It bounced a little bit. He could have saved it, and he ended up not doing so. But the question is, I mean, and I think, yes, the reason why FC Cincinnati is the way they are this season is because of their defense. It's not because of their offense. I think that they've stayed the same as they were last year. I mean, boy, was that an electric team last year. But the difference between fifth seed and first seed is a defense, and I think they're proving it as such this weekend, even in the bad ways. And I think it really truly shows what this team needs to do to improve down the stretch. And I think especially before Miazga and crew come back, because I think, yes, I did say this last week that like, oh yeah, this team is going to get better over time. Like it shows they can still keep up a supporter shield type caliber. But I'm really starting to doubt myself. And I think the other thing was when I was watching the Toronto FC game, I didn't really say it out loud because I felt like it would be a little egregious to say, but I'm going to say it now. Toronto played very stupid in that game. They played really stupid. I mean, there were sometimes FC Cincinnati strung passes, and I was like, all right, well, it's not the best. It's a little lackluster. And then I saw what Toronto did, and I was like, all right, never mind. They're more lackluster. Like, at the very least, FC Cincinnati was the better team, right? I mean, kind of goes to what I said. They're not perfect, but they're better. They're good. They're great, you know? And I think that's what we need to see from FC Cincinnati this weekend as well. Is definitely try to get the confidence up. You're back home. You're at TQL Stadium, and it's a big match too. We'll get to that later, but you need everybody and anybody in that stadium on the pitch, wherever, to really show their caliber this weekend. And I think some of the guys, and I think Baji played a decent game. He could have had some good chances to score as well later in the match. Marco Angulo, I think, is another guy as well. He's played decent as an eight. I think, especially with Junior Moreno out. But as a 10, he has not played well. And I think there were a few times in that DC game where he could have taken a one time touch, or he could have had a better shot or a better accuracy. It would have led to an assist, it would have led to a goal. Instead, neither one ends up happening. So I would say I think Marco Angulo needs to improve, but I've been hard on Angulo this entire season. Kimi Ordonez, and I think this is a very interesting point in the sense that Ordonez was supposed to join Guatemala for the Gold Cup and be on that squad. He actually turned it down and said, I'm going to stay with FC Cincinnati. And I mean, I would probably guess why. I mean, Bupenza's not coming for a little while. Brenner's got some injuries. Maybe we see Brenner start today because it will be his final game for the club. But nonetheless, there is a good chance that we see Kimi out there. Definitely out there just playing his heart out. I think the biggest thing is he needs to grow confidence in the final third because there are some times he's starting to second guess himself where it's like maybe he goes back, maybe he goes to pass it in the middle. And because of that second guessing, because of that hesitation, he's not getting to the ball. And thus, FC Cincinnati is not getting too many chances. And again, we saw what it was against DC United, and DC United's a good team. Because of that win, they are now in the playoff picture as the ninth seed. So they would face the eighth seed in a play-in matchup. But you look at FC Cincinnati's schedule past that. You have the Revs this weekend. Next weekend, you've got Charlotte FC on the road. And then you've got some other interesting games. Again, let's see how far the US up. I think they're going to the final. Let's see. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But, you know, let's see. But let's see what happens with FC Cincinnati. And I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing, and I talked about this on Saturday, was the fact that, like, maybe because Wayne Rooney played with Lucho Acosta, this happened. But because Lucho Acosta was the engine, this team struggled to find ways to attack, where Acosta had to just attempt a shot from outside the box, or same went for Barrial. And that may work in a league like Premier League or Bundesliga, but doesn't really work in MLS where you're gonna have to be a little bit more fundamental on the ball, mainly because the talent is just not there overall from a lot of these players. So when you look at how this team is playing, it runs through Lucho Acosta. It's true. The one thing I noticed in the St. Louis game, and I mentioned it last week, is the ways that St. Louis isolates him, and not just isolates him away from the ball so he could not drive up the pitch and not dribble, where he was forced to make those long balls, which ended up working to some extent. I mean, kind of shows what Cincinnati can do at their best, or in this case, even at their worst. But it does show ways where you can isolate Lucho Acosta, drive him up the pitch, and really be an engine, right? It almost felt like if he was an engine, he would be in the back almost. It was almost like the engine's got the coal in it, but the wheels are turning very fast. The wheels are almost like compensating for the lack of work that the engine's doing. And no disrespect to Acosta, it's just that in terms of attacking presence, we didn't see much of him in that regards. So on to New England. And this was a grudge match when these two faced off April 29th in New England. Make any Taylor Swift jokes you want off that date. But nonetheless, both of those teams were very close to each other in that matchup. And historically speaking, that was a big matchup because it was the first time, I think, in like a few match days that you had two teams that were at least 20 points facing each other. I mean, at that point, New England had only lost one match. FC Cincinnati had only lost one match. Both of them were at 20 points, and both of them were tied for the top of the East. That one ended out 1-all, could have gone 2-1. I think FC Cincinnati, at least from what I've heard and from the highlights, they had the better chances in that game to get a victory on the road, which would have been saying something, knowing how Gillette Stadium, I mean, not just with the Patriots, but even with the Rebs, has become a fortress for New England and for Boston sports fans. So the question does become, it is still a top two game. And I think because of the Gold Cup, it's a little bit interesting in how you phrase it. Because yes, FC Cincinnati has 43 points and is in first. New England is second and 35. And actually, in that regards, they're first and second in the Supporters' Shield race as well. But this is a New England side that still has Carles Gil, still has Gustavo Bo, no DeJuan Jones, but you still have your core. You still have your number 10 and your number 9. So the biggest question I have, and especially knowing what we saw from guys like Click and guys like Benteke last week for DC United, does New England really try to show their caliber, show their presence, and say, you know what, FC Cincinnati, yes, you may be the best, but we're going to take points from you. We're going to cut into that lead. And that could end up paying dividends come the end of the season because, you know, you look at FC Cincinnati's schedule, they don't get back-to-back home games. They had a lot, but they're not going to get too many homestands for the rest of the year or going back and forth. So they need to take this command at home and try to get win number 12 on the year, go 12-0 at home. And I think that plays into the confidence. And I think because of the confidence, it plays into the command. Hopefully, Yuya Kubo's back after being out with an illness. Baji, hopefully he can get on the ball. And definitely Lucho as well, who actually could be the MLS All-Star captain. So go to MLSsoccer.com and vote for Lucho Acosta to be the captain in that one. Would be very interesting if he does get that position because he did play for DC United for a few years. The game is at Audi Field this year, home of DC United. So it would be interesting if Lucho gets it. But back to the game. This is a statement. If FC Cincinnati can beat the Rebs, or at the very least take a point, I think. I wouldn't be surprised if they just take a point. If they can do that, I would be very happy for this team. And I think it'd also be very happy if they can get a result and definitely if they can get a win, send Brenner off onto Italy with a W and with a lot of great experience here in Cincinnati. So for FC Cincinnati, I'm going to give them an A+ this year. I mean, obviously building off from last year, really shows their presence. Columbus Crew, again, really great work this year and really great work last week as well. 1-2-0 over Nashville. And they've got Lucas Rayon back. They've got their confidence back as well after what was a rather unfortunate result in New York against NYCFC. This was a very similar meeting to what we saw in Nashville when these two faced off this past week. Although in that matchup, it was Nashville who was up by a goal going into stoppage time, end-to-end action, and then Nashville ends up getting the capper in the death of stoppage time. Columbus Crew ends up doing the same thing. It was 1-0 going into stoppage time. They're able to get a late goal, seal the deal, and get the 2-0 win. So, yes, they won by 2 goals, but that doesn't do justice to how both teams just played overall. It would be very interesting if we see these two in a playoff matchup because, oh boy, it would be very, very electric. So let's take a look at some of the players who are really good. Christian Ramirez. I mean, I was a little discouraged about Christian Ramirez, I'll be honest with you, because I remember seeing him play, or rather, I heard the announcement, I was like, bingo, you're going to have Cucho and Ramirez. But then I see him sitting on the bench a little while after a little while after a little while. And I think some of it also goes to the fact that he was with Scotland, or rather, he was with Aberdeen in Scotland. And because of that, he was playing in the winter, unlike the US, where MLS is a spring to fall league. But at the same time, the way he's come back after having that rest, quite impressive. 7 goals this season in 15 appearances, and he had the game winner last week. And he's now got 4 goals in the past 4 games. I mean, he's really showing up and almost gives a little bit of the load off of Cucho Hernandez because the way he carried that team, where you have a 10 and a 9, and if you're a center back, you know how to deal with one striker. But when you have two, it's double trouble, especially knowing the fact that I think Cucho has learned how to play on the wing this year, which has really helped with the team's caliber. It almost reminds me of how Carlos Vela and Denny Boanga are doing with LAFC. And this is a hot take, but I'm going to say it right here. I think the way that Cucho Hernandez and Christian Ramirez have been playing, I think it's actually better than how Carlos Vela and Denny Boanga are playing. And that's saying something, especially since Boanga could win MVP this year. But think about Vela's service. He's not getting that too many goals this year. He could be providing services, but it's also based off a lot of other guys like Buke, Bogush, Opoku, a lot of other guys that could be played in the space. With Columbus, it is only those two guys, Cucho Hernandez and Christian Ramirez. And the way both of those guys have shown up this year, almost being a tandem in ways to pass the ball in, especially knowing that I think, contrary to LAFC, Columbus has a great number 10 in Lucas Zelarayan. So in ways, you do have like a 3 base setup, almost similar to how FC Cincinnati was last year, where they had Acosta on the 10 and then Brenner and Vasquez up top. Both guys can play on the wing. Both guys can slot inside. Both guys can score as well. And I think that's probably the most electric way you can go about scoring in some ways. But I think a two-striker formation may actually be better. I'm trying to think about MLS teams and the formations that they use, especially the teams that won MLS Cup. LAFC usually runs a 4-3-3. Same goes for NYCFC. Sometimes they go 4-2-3-1. And then you look back to Columbus, they ran a 4-2-3-1 in 2020 when they won. So to some extent, maybe a two-striker system is not the best, but sometimes it happens. I mean, we saw it in 2017, Toronto FC. They ran a 3-5-2, which included Sebastian Javinko and Josie Altidore up top. So you never know what can happen with that duo. But I think from what we've seen, especially I think the past month or so, because Buanga has started to cool off as the years gone along with LAFC as a team in general. Meanwhile, Columbus has remained consistent in being an overall playoff picture type team. And I think from the way we've seen Columbus this year, especially in the playoffs, or rather in their way to get back to the playoffs after the turmoil and rather the heartbreak from last year where they were dropping points, especially late in matches, that's a welcome sign for Columbus to really show themselves to say, hey, this is going to be the team that changes it over. And some of that goes to Wilfred Nancy's credit. I'm going to give Columbus a B plus. They've definitely shown their caliber and they're playing really good. I mean, the way they've improved this year, the way they've been able to get those victories, especially at home, it's something really special. Speaking about home, lower.com field will be a sellout tonight as Columbus hosts the New York Red Bulls. So similar with FC Cincinnati, they're taking on a perennial team that is from the East Coast. And the Red Bulls, again, this is a team that was at a time 5-10 years ago a staple. I mean, they were old money when it came to MLS. They were a team that were always caliber, never got an MLS Cup, but they were always a caliber team. And it's also interesting too, fun fact, just came to my head right now. The Columbus Crew against New York Red Bulls rematch of the MLS Cup final from 2008, in which Columbus won 3-1 to get their first ever MLS Cup trophy. So it is a lot of interesting, historically speaking, interesting factoids and an interesting storyline for this week. But to the game itself, back in 2023, it is an interesting team to look at when you look at the Red Bulls, because it could be a team lacking identity. And yes, they do have Lewis Morgan, but how much have we heard him on the main stage? We haven't heard of the Lewis Morgan that was dominating and rather leading a Miami squad that was really good. I mean, a Miami squad that included guys like Gonzalo Higuain on that team. But maybe that's a problem. Maybe they don't have good culture. And I mean, we've seen it too with the Van Sears stuff that came out earlier this year. It could just be road play in general too. And I think that might be the one thing that's haunting the Red Bulls, as they've only had one win on the road this entire year, four losses and four draws. They're currently at 23 points. That's 11th in the league, or rather in the Eastern Conference. That is below the playoff cutoff line, but it is still pretty tight. They got a draw against Charlotte on June 21st, and then a 4-0 win over Atlanta on Saturday. So maybe there's a chance this team can start to get the wheels back together, or Atlanta was maybe just not at the right place at the right time. You never know what can happen. But I think this was a Red Bulls team that when Jesse Marsch was in charge of them, they would always have some sort of command that wherever they went, they were going to put up a dogfight. They were not going to let the other team get 3 points or get a result. They were going to take it all for the cake. And that's what made the Red Bulls such a good team when Jesse Marsch was coaching them. And honestly, maybe that's why Jesse Marsch should have been the U.S. men's national team head coach, in my opinion. That's another story for another day. But back to Columbus and New York, it is interesting to see what this team can do. I mean, you get two results. Maybe you get a chance to get a third, and that's a big result for the Red Bulls if they can go into a sold-out Lower.com field and get a result. That being said, this is Lower.com field, and the only team that has won this year at that place, surprisingly enough, is Inter Miami, the worst team in the Eastern Conference right now. It's a funny conundrum, but hey, when you look at how this Columbus Red Bulls game lines up, it is a pretty full game, in my opinion, in the sense that you have Lewis Morgan, and for the most part, most of the key pieces. I think Caden Clark is still with him. I don't think he's on the Gold Cup team. Correct me if I'm wrong. But nonetheless, it is interesting to see that type of presence from the Red Bulls down straight. And the same goes for Columbus. I mean, the fact that only Aiden Morris is going to the Gold Cup, and the fact that you have guys like Amundsen, Zawadzki, and Nagby that can fill in off the bench, that's saying something. That's saying something about this team right there. The fact that they have the depth that they do is quite amazing. And I've mentioned it this year. I think when you look at a whole 23, I think Columbus might have the best 23 in the league because of the way that depth shows up in big games. And I think this is a big game. You know, it's 4th of July weekend. You're about halfway through the season, and you got a good chance to really show your caliber overall and maybe get that B plus up to an A, up to an A plus, maybe, if they can really contend with guys like Nashville, like New England, like Cincinnati, and get those results at the very least at home, and then maybe even transfer it on the road. So that's it for this episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. A lot to talk about, a lot of quick hits, lots of grades to give out too. Overall, pretty solid. I mean, compared to what we've seen in the past few years, this is a pretty relieving sight to see as an Ohio sports fan, and I hope you see it that way as well. I'm Mahirson Hassan, your host. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe. Have a great 4th of July weekend. Get out, celebrate the holiday with all of your peeps, and I will see you next week.